The Town of Los Gatos Planning Commission meeting of Wednesday, April 10, 2019 is now called to order. Please take a moment to silence your devices. Ms. Arnowitz, could you please call the roll?
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Badami?
Here.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Here.
Commissioner Tavana?
Here.
Commissioner Janoff?
Here.
Vice Chair Hansen?
Here.
Chair Hudas?
Here.
And then, for the record, Commissioner Birch is absent today.
Okay, I would ask everyone stand and join Commissioner Tavana in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As the Planning Commission conducts this meeting this evening on behalf of the Town Council and residents of Los Gatos, we encourage active participation, which is essential for democracy and critical to the work of the Planning Commission. The participation can occur through written comments about agenda items submitted to the staff prior to the meeting, and we've received quite a few of those tonight. During our meeting, there are two opportunities for members of the public to participate. During the verbal communication period, an item may speak on any item that is not on the agenda, and during a specific item, the public may speak about that item that is on the agenda. If you wish to address the commission tonight during verbal communication period or during consideration of an agenda item, please complete one of those yellow cards that's behind the back of the benches that you're seated on. Turn the card into a staff member and please print your name clearly. When you speak, I ask that you come up to the podium and adjust the microphone so that you're speaking directly into it. Please state your name and address for the record. In fairness to all who wish to speak at this meeting, it's requested that you limit your comments to 3 minutes. So, verbal communications, does anyone from the public would like to speak about an item that is not on the agenda of tonight's meeting? Okay, see none. And so we now move on to the consent calendar. We have, I believe, 2 items to be acted on tonight on the consent calendar. We have approval of the minutes, March 27, 2019, and the second item is 460 Monterey Avenue, Architecture and Site Application S-19-009, and the applicant is requesting a continuance to May 8, 2019. Do we have a motion on the consent calendar? Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'll move to approve the consent calendar.
Commissioner Badami.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. In favor? Opposed? Passes unanimously. So we now move on to the public hearings, and the next item is agenda item number 3, which is 17020 Los Cerritos Drive, Architecture and Site Application S-16-065, requesting approval for site improvements requiring a grading permit on a property zoned HR1, APN 532-21012 and 13. Property owners Sandy Campbell, applicant Glenn Katz, project planner Aaron Walters. This item was continued from February 13, 2019, and I believe everyone present tonight was at that hearing. May I have a show of hands from commissioners who visited the property under consideration? Okay, everyone indicates. And are there any disclosures? Okay, Ms. Walters, I understand you will be giving the staff report this evening.
Yes, thank you and good evening. Per the direction of the commission at the last February 13th meeting, the applicant has provided a feasibility analysis for an alternative to restore the hillside in both the driveway area as well as the rear yard area to grades that existed prior to installation of the unpermitted retaining walls and grading. Per the direction of the commission, the applicant has also proposed alternative retaining wall designs to help mitigate both, again, the rear yard and driveway areas. These designs now meet the 5 feet maximum retaining wall height and meet the exposed uninterrupted retaining wall lengths that are less than 50 linear feet, and also reduces grading outside of the LRDA, and these are all per the Hillside Design Guidelines standards. The proposed remediation includes retaining the unpermitted walls in the rear, adding a structural buttressing system in front of that existing retaining wall, and then building a series of multi-terrace retaining walls in front of that with landscaping to meet the Hillside Design Guidelines. The applicant proposes the design in the rear yard. This is located on sheet M3 in Exhibit 12. And they also propose alternative 2 for the driveway area, and that is located in sheet M2, attachment 12. The proposed project still would require exceptions to the Hillside Design Guidelines standards, which include grading outside of the LRDA and also exceeding the maximum allowable fill depths for yards and driveway areas. Should the Planning Commission find merit with the revised project, the Commission may grant exceptions to the Hillside Design Guidelines. So this concludes staff's presentation, both planning and public works. Staff is here to answer any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Walters? Mr. Hanson?
I just had one question. The exceptions that remain are incremental to the exceptions that existed before we considered this item,
That
or
is-
not?
That is
Okay.
correct. They've reduced it by three exceptions.
Okay.
Okay, other questions? Okay, now ask the applicant to come forward, and you have 10 minutes. And just please state your name and address for the record, and then if you could please provide a card afterwards, that'd be great.
Okay, so thank you, Commissioners, for the opportunity to come address you again. My name is Glenn Katz. My address is 2164 Vizcaya Circle in Campbell, California, and I'm joined here by tonight with the homeowner, Sandy Campbell. Okay, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come back and address some of the concerns and explain some proposed additional mitigations to help bring the proposed project in line with the Hillside Design Standards and Guidelines. Basically, we have a presentation that really kind of visually presents a lot of the information that is in the exhibits that you have in front of you. But we'll just kind of step you through this to sort of really explain in more detail exactly what we're proposing and hopefully be able to answer any questions you might have. Okay, so these two first visuals are just the final rendering of what the driveway area would look like and the rear yard area. You can see that we're proposing a series of like stepped retaining walls here to kind of basically mitigate that height and bring it down so that individually all the walls are within the specific guidelines. Same thing here in the rear yard. In the rear yard area, there's the existing wall and then the new wall that's kind of coming in front of it. Although we have modified the existing wall a little bit to go ahead and reduce the total amount of it's the total length before the unobstructed length, or I forget what the name of the specific term is. Okay, in terms of just orienting you to what's in the packet overall, the idea is these two areas, the driveway area and the rear yard area, are the area of concern. What we've done is basically prepared a restoration analysis as well as two different mitigation alternatives for the driveway area. In the rear yard area, we looked at the restoration analysis, and just with one mitigation measure, I think we're able to meet, again, most of the guidelines. So although we've modified all those proposals relative to what we presented last time. So everything's come a little bit further along. In terms of thinking about the driveway area and the restoration analysis, the basic scheme would be that the existing wall would stay. Here's a visual that just sort of explains that area which is currently shown in red is the wall which was added, which is currently out of compliance. So that's the wall that's too tall right now, that whole red area. There's a little length of that wall that is shown in green that already is in compliance, okay, at least in terms of the height. Okay. If we try to restore, the basic scheme is explained in this diagram. What we need to do is what's called benching, to basically step the soil back to create a stable engineered base for it, okay, that can go ahead and be guaranteed in terms of like providing a solid foundation. Then engineered fill would be added on top of that. Okay, so visually it would look something like this. We would have to kind of cut under the front of the existing wall, the toe of the wall, as well as kind of step back up the hillside. So you do this thing that sometimes we call chasing the hillside in terms of trying to come up with something that would ultimately be stable. We'd have to cut back higher in order to do that, and then restore the soil at a 2-to-1 ratio. which is what's allowable from a geotechnical side standpoint. If we went after this strategy, basically the uninterrupted wall length would, well, that is the 115 feet that it would be kind of with the restored wall. The additional cut that would be required here would be 587 cubic yards. So that's 587 cubic yards. It's 10 feet deep. Ultimately, it's around 70 truckloads worth of soil. Additional fill to come back in and fill that all back in would be 14 feet deep, 1,114 cubic yards, somewhere around 140 truckloads. So this approach is, we would recommend, very impactful in terms of trying to do something like this. There's an awful lot of kind of work, not only in terms of the expense, but just in terms of the trucks coming in, the disruption, the time involved. It's, I think, just very impactful on the community to go through and try and do something like this. So that's why we're presenting the analysis, but recommending that we actually move forward with one of the mitigation measures as opposed to heading in this direction. In terms of the mitigation measures, these visuals help to explain a little bit more about the buttressing scheme and how we would like to do that. So here's the existing wall. Okay, the idea is that we would provide these structural buttresses across the front of the wall. There's 19 of those buttresses, so one at basically every 5 feet. Okay, and then in front of that, there would be this terraced retaining wall built here. In this final diagram down here, again, the area in red is exceeding the 5 feet. The area in green is all less than the 5 feet. So the way to kind of read that as the key is that if it's in green, it's meeting the height guidelines. The uninterrupted wall length got reduced quite a bit in terms of doing this because we can kind of stagger the wall to meet that guideline. We wouldn't need to do any additional cutting. We would need to go back in and fill the planters, though, to go ahead and create that terracing. Okay, so this is the first scheme for the mitigation. Again, this is a little bit different than what was proposed last time. We went through and just kind of continued this wall all the way across. Previously, we were asking for an exception there to allow some of that not to be filled in. In mitigation alternative 2, which brings everything completely within the scheme of the height restrictions as well as the uninterrupted wall length, we'd basically put 2 terracing walls in this area. The same buttressing scheme would be used, but the terracing would just have an additional layer coming out just a little bit further. So again, this has a little more additional fill just because of the 2 different planters, but no additional cutting is required in this case. Just to sort of visually understand the height of those walls, I know that was a question we had last time. If it was a single wall and we had the 12'4" to deal with, we'd have 5 feet on the front wall and 7'4" on the back wall. In mitigation alternative 2, by stepping it down as 2 different stages, we can bring each of those walls to 4 feet or less. So this is the worst case section, the highest section. It would be better in other places. If we look at the rear yard area, it's not quite as tall, so it's a little less impactful in terms of what's going on over there. The restoration analysis shows here, again, stepping back and then refilling back in there. So we do some benching, okay, then ultimately bury the wall and put the earth back in. In this case, the additional cut would be about 162 cubic yards, or 7.8 feet. Then you got 20 truckloads there. The additional fill would be 442 cubic yards, or about 53 truckloads there. So again, this is, to our engineering estimate, not as good a solution as doing it with retaining walls. It's both impactful, but also just, going through and doing this type of geotechnical engineering is really what a retaining wall solution is a better engineering solution than trying to do this strictly just with the soil, because it's more certain and predictable about what the outcome will be. Whereas once we try to do this just strictly with the geotechnicals, it's a little bit harder to guarantee the result. Okay, for the mitigation strategy, here we look at the existing wall, we add the buttressing to the wall. Actually, it's not quite accurate right there in that we would go through and add a little bit of a notch to the wall to help out with the uninterrupted wall length to make sure we're meeting that guideline too. But the idea is that we'd go ahead and buttress, and this would only require a single terracing wall in front of the existing wall to bring it into compliance with those guidelines. So again, a little bit of additional fill just for the planter area here, with the buttresses buried behind the planter. So in terms of the wall section, what it would look like, again, it's about 7 feet at its worst case here. So there'd be 4 feet of wall exposed with 3 feet in front of that, and just sort of natural vegetation in the background there to kind of fill those planters and hopefully make that look good. So again, here is the kind of final effect that we think, with stone on the wall and the right finishes, could actually be made to look quite good with a natural landscape, and really, I think, visually kind of address many of the different concerns. But really, overall, I think do a good job of sort of mitigating some of the different concerns. The way I look at these overall proposals is, again, it's not a complete solution. The whole notion of the excavation that was outside of the LRDA, again, is a very hard thing to fix. I think a very impactful thing to try and fix. The fact that we've already cut a little bit lower, or cut lower than what the guidelines recommend, again, that's a hard thing to fix. The solutions that we're proposing, we think, are doing a good job of substantially meeting like all the guidelines, or the guidelines that can be met, kind of in a reasonable way, in a way that sort of addresses the visual intent, as well as does it in a low impact way that hopefully won't create a big impact on the entire neighborhood. Okay, so that's basically what we're proposing in this round.
Thank you. You have a little more time, but we can also go to questions if you're ready.
I think we're probably ready for questions.
Okay, any questions? Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, thank you for the revised presentation and the alternatives. The only clarification I'm asking is, in these two renderings, am I to understand that the grassy area that's basically on the same elevation as the driveway,
Okay.
or the planted area that's essentially on the same elevation as the lawn, do those two areas separately represent the LRDA footprint?
No, I'm trying to think. This area, no, that is still not exactly the LRDA footprint. This one's actually very close to what that original line was. Okay, back in here, the LRDA, it's further back out in there, so it's somewhere between this wall and that wall.
So, excuse me, it's fair to say that in the top view, you haven't quite restored back to the elevation of the LRDA, because that was a hillside slope. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, no, it's really, it originally came out a little bit further and was a little bit taller in here. Okay, so, this mitigation here reduces the incursion into the LRDA 6 feet. It pulls it forward, but it doesn't fully restore it to the LRDA.
And do you know off the top of your head what the actual incursion into the LRDA was in terms of feet?
I don't have that number right off the top of my head, but we could again kind of look on the diagram on the wall back in there. We can sort of see where the LRDA is and then where the wall is back there. If I was guesstimating from this distance, it looks like maybe at its worst case, which is right about in here.
You can take the microphone and come forward if you'd like.
Oh, okay. I forgot about that. Did I turn? Okay, great, there. So let me, if I can. Just based on this distance here being about 6 feet, I think, to my eye, there's probably at its absolute worst case maybe 8 feet right there. But again, that's the worst case. You'll see that the restoration actually exceeds the LRIDA in some places. So you can see that for, probably 70–75% of the wall, it is restoring it to the LRIDA. There's just this one little particular protrusion where it's not coming out nearly as far.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was actually my same question about whether the LRDA is being restored. And we were talking about both areas. So you were showing us the driveway, the rear yard. What's the answer on the rear yard?
In the rear yard, let's go ahead and take a look at that. Again, we'll come on back. It's in the diagram up there. The LRDA is the heavy line that's shown right here. Again, if that's 3 feet, I think in there, I would guess that at its worst point right about in here, maybe like 10 feet or something like that, because that's 3 feet to there. But again, yeah, I don't have the precise number, but we could try to scale that.
That's good. Thank you. Other questions? Okay. We now move to the public portion of the hearing, and we'll invite comments from members of the public. Would anyone like to speak about this? Okay, seeing none. Mr. Katz, you do have an additional 5 minutes if you'd like to summarize, or you have anything additional you'd like to add?
I'm trying to think. No, I guess I would just reinforce our. Oh, that's no worries.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, I guess in summary, I would just relate that again. I think that the measures that are being proposed are, good faith measures to substantially conform to a way that tries to meet the intent of the guidelines and does so in a way that's, sensitive to the community and not trying to be very impactful. So, I would just, highly recommend these as being, what would I call them? Oh, just like reasonable solutions. Doing the best to meet as much of the intent as we can, but again, not trying to, ultimately negatively impact the community.
Thank you. Any questions? Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. In looking at your drawings, I'm looking at mitigation alternative number 1 and alternative number 2.
Yes.
And your estimated costs. The cost for alternative 1 is $190,000, and the cost for alternative number 2 is another $105,000 for a total of $295,000. Can you? I assume you have a preference as between those two as far as a recommendation is concerned.
Well, yeah, it's quite a bit more to go through and kind of add the second wall. So let me go back to that again. From a cost standpoint, it's what I'd say it's preferable to go ahead and just accept mitigation alternative 1. The problem or the limitation of that is that it's slightly higher than the 5 foot right there. But, given the choice, if mitigation alternative 1 were acceptable, I'd recommend going that way. Mitigation alternative 2 is really presented as one step further as the additional cost that would be necessary to really, meet that one more guideline.
So your argument, so to speak, for 1 is based on cost.
In terms of the distinction, that would be the justification for choosing 1 over 2.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess also, in terms of just the raw amount of dirt and the number of truckloads, and there's some additional construction considerations in terms of the impact on the community, where 1 takes a little bit more work than 2 and has a bigger impact on the community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Hanson.
I wanted to thank you for addressing the concerns that we brought up and bringing us all these alternatives and having great pictures. Not that that I'm going there that you should do this, but I wanted to understand just a little bit more with the restoration alternative. Is benching the only feasible technical solution for filling in, and you were very clear about the additional cut and fill and all that stuff.
It really is, based on the geotechnical engineer's recommendations, the only way to do that. At the time, when you fill it in, essentially the retaining wall becomes useless at that point. So what you really have to do is then depend upon the stability of the soil itself and get into this very engineered benching solution with the, cutting it out, putting the engineered fill in, and then ultimately covering it over. So, geotechnically, that's the only way to do it.
And clearly, environmentally, it has more of an impact as well.
Oh, clearly, yeah.
So, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Just one question.
Yes.
On the alternative 1. That's the worst case is
Yes.
the 7'4"
Yes.
and 5. Roughly, do you have an idea of what the average is as compared to the worst case along that entire run? Is half of it over the 5 foot limit, or is
again,
a little bit of it?
We'd have to go back and look at the engineering drawings. My recollection of it would be that, less than 50%, probably like 30% of it has this 12-foot height, and then it starts tapering on down on the sides. So it's that same area like where the LRDA, the biggest intrusion is, the biggest cut back in. It's that little knob where you have that 12-foot height. As you taper on out to the parts that are closer to where the LRDA is, the height isn't as great. So, that wouldn't require 2 everywhere.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Commissioner Tavana.
Just a quick question here. So for the rendering drawings for the restoration analysis, both pictures show when you're benching, you're removing some trees. Just, I know it's just a rendering. Is that actually the case? Will that require tree removal?
Actually, to the extent that the trees are there, I'd have to look at the site plan, but I do think it starts to impact some of the trees. Yeah, and I think there are some oaks on that. Again, I'm not 100% certain, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that those are there, like realistically, as opposed to just figuratively.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Katz.
Thank you.
We'll now close the public portion of the hearing and move to questions of staff or discussion of what's in front of us. Are there any questions of staff? Commissioner O'Donnell.
The last question relating to trees, did staff evaluate how many trees would be removed for either alternative?
Hi. There would be, these are accurate in terms of where the trees are for the driveway area. So you would see there's at least 3 on the driveway section, and on the rear yard section, there's approximately 3 to 4 that would have to be altered with the benching. I'm sorry, removed. They'd have to be removed.
Maybe I'm forgetting, but normally we have an arborist report relating to the trees, their conditions, and that kind of thing. I don't recall one here today.
So we did an initial evaluation of what happened after the unpermitted work was done, and it was determined that the trees were in good condition that were out there right now. With regards to the proposals, we did not have an arborist take a look at this alternative, the restoration analysis. The other alternatives do not impact trees.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, comments or discussion? Commissioner Janoff?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm encouraged to see the 2 alternatives. They are essentially what we asked the applicant to bring forward for consideration. And I do think that the restoration analysis is not an ideal, not only because of the trees, but you're just adding so much more disruption on top of the disruption that already occurred. I'm not sure that makes sense to me. So I don't think I would support the restoration analysis, but I do support the mitigation alternative number 2 for the driveway area, although it's a modest restoration of the LRDA from to 6 additional feet when there's quite a bit of the LRDA that had been removed. I'm wondering whether the 3-foot depths of those terraces might be extended a little bit to just make them a little bit more of a graceful stepping up the hillside instead of just a pretty steep sort of narrow chop, because a lot of that 3 feet is going to be taken up by the retaining walls themselves. So it's going to limit that depth. So that my sense is that for the driveway area, alternative number 2, but perhaps increasing the depths of those terraces would be a good solution.
Thank you. Other comments? Commissioner O'Donnell?
I find it very troubling in the sense that you can't go back again. In other words, we can't go back and ignore the fact that it is what it is. It's been changed. When I look at what has been proposed, and I think it's a nice job, you did a good job, but I still come back to where will we be at the end of the day? And when I look at the costs involved, there's a $105,000 difference between alternative 1 and alternative 2. And I just wonder if it's worth the additional, $100,000 is a lot of money. Now, this is not by way of excusing what went on before, but I would just like to make sure that we're causing the spending of that money in a reasonable way. I don't disagree with your comment at all that it does appear to be the better way to go. I'm just troubled a little bit about where we find ourselves and how much it's costing not to go back to where it would have been had this not occurred. Now, that's not our fault. That's not the town's fault. It's just, I'm just curious how other people feel. It bothers me that we may cause the spending of a lot of money and still not really be satisfied. So I guess the argument is, but we'll be more satisfied than we are with the present situation. But I'd appreciate any comments from my fellow commissioners.
So I have a question for staff on that. And to what degree does cost enter into the considerations for the Planning Commission on something like this?
It really shouldn't. We've told you that over and over. You shouldn't consider the financial implications for a project and whether it's feasible or not. We talk about that many times. The reason I hesitate, it's a little bit different. It's almost like a code enforcement case here you're having, so it's a little bit different. The project's already been approved. It's not the feasibility of the project. You're looking now for mitigation for not following our code. So it's a little bit different in that sense. I compare it to when we had a couple of cases with council had to do with permits that were not received in the historical district, and some of the fines were so large they reduced them to half. So it is within your purview to consider that maybe, but typically no, it's not. And that's why I hesitated. Financial feasibility shouldn't be part of your domain.
Thank you. Other commissioner? Yeah, Commissioner Hanson.
So I do agree that that the mitigation alternative 2 for the driveway and the mitigation for oh gosh, my phone's I'm sorry about that. The mitigation for the rear yard are the preferred alternatives. But conceptually speaking, I do think that if you think about this, when the whole idea is to minimize the impact on the hillsides, we're building more stuff or taking away more stuff and cutting. So at the final analysis, we are where we are, but we're basically adding a whole lot more into the hillside to make this look more like what it should have looked like from the beginning. Having said that, I do prefer the mitigation alternative 2 because since we're talking about a violation of our hillside design guidelines and standards, I would prefer whatever mitigation come as close as we can to meeting the guidelines. Because we don't want to be sending a message to other people that they can just go do this and then say, oops, I didn't know and I'm going to, do something about it later.
Commissioner Badami.
If I could, through the chair, ask if Vice Chair Hanson could clarify her comments on the restoration analysis aspect, because I know Commissioner Janoff was not in favor of it.
I said the mitigation alternative 2, and then the mitigation in the case of the rear yard.
The rear yard as well.
Yes. I mean, clearly the cut and fill that's involved with the restoration analysis, the impacts on the trees, it's not a feasible alternative. But what I was saying in general is that all of these alternatives involve more disruption to our hillsides because you're building more stuff. But we are where we are, and so I'm in favor of mitigation alternative 2 in the case of the driveway and the mitigation alternative in the case of the rear yard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? I might add a comment that although I think that in some ways alternative 2 is closer to our guidelines, I also feel that there's some other factors here that would say that alternative 1, in my mind, is going far enough, in that this is not an area that's visible outside of the property itself, and there's still a lot of work that is being done, and that perhaps the part that does exceed our guidelines, which is I think 5 feet, we had testimony that that's 30% or less of that entire length. So I don't I don't feel that alternative one is off the table. I would somewhat lean toward that one for those reasons. But obviously, these are, I think, both good alternatives. Commissioner Badami?
I find it compelling that we could go with alternative number one as well. When I read this and digested it over the weekend, I was thinking, well, alternative two is the way to go. But listening to the comments by Chair Hudes and Commissioner O'Donnell, I could go with alternative number one as well. And I think the applicant would appreciate that as well.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I just think your comments were certainly mirror the way I think too. So I just wanted to say that it isn't that alternative two might not be, in some senses, a better alternative. But when I look at what it does to the existing backyard and the movement of dirt and the truckloads and all that thing, and then you ask, and what is the end result? The backyard is so located that almost no one else can see it except the occupant there. So that weighs too. So I guess long way around, I tend to agree with what the chair proposed.
Commissioner Janoff?
Yeah, I think this is tough because we're persuaded by the numbers, and perhaps we shouldn't be seeing the costs. But I do feel strongly that the intent was to come into closer compliance with the Hillside Design Guidelines, and it's unfortunate that it comes at a cost that we're looking at that. But the guidelines are clear, and it's trying to restore the situation as closely as we can to what it should be. I am sympathetic to the costs, but I think I personally would want to stand firm on meeting the Hillside Guidelines. The other thing I would say is, typically we don't say, well, you can't see it, so therefore it doesn't matter what you do, because in many of the decisions that we make, particularly, for instance, in historic preservation, we make very careful consideration that all sides of the structure, whether they're visible from the street or not, have integrity to the front and what is visible. So I'm not persuaded by the nobody sees this but whoever is down there argument. I think there is there's a philosophy of integrity that I feel compelled to adhere to.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I'm agreeing with everybody tonight, but I will say you should take into account the movement of earth, the number of trucks involved. The neighbors will certainly see that. Yes, it does, the tree falling in the forest, which is what this case is somewhat about, the tree falling in the forest. But I do think that with the use of the trucks and the environmental consequences of the use of additional trucks, it is not stepping out of our role to take that into consideration and to weigh that as against the two proposals. One can look at it simply and not weigh that, or one can look at it and say, well, that's something that should be weighed. So I'm not arguing with anybody. I just throw that out as something to consider.
Commissioner Tavana?
After reviewing this, I would say the damage is already done here. And looking at these alternatives, I appreciate, being able to actually visualize how this would look when it's all said and done. With that said, I would say, mitigation 1 or 2, I would be fine with moving forward. Whatever the commission agrees upon.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell?
Why don't I try a motion? Because we have an even number tonight. For a while there, I thought it might be 3-3, but maybe it won't be. Well, so if I make a motion, we'll find out. Thank you. Okay, the motion would be that we approve the proposals, and in particular, as to the driveway, that's proposal number 1, not number 2. That we find that the project is categorically exempt pursuant to the guidelines for the implementation of the California Environmental Quality Act, that as required by the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines, the project is in or will be in compliance with the applicable sections of those guidelines and standards, other than the requested exceptions, and this motion would include the approval of those exceptions, which have been previously identified. That would be for grading outside the least restrictive development area as previously described, and exceeding the maximum allowable cut depths, i.e. 4 feet for the yards, and exceeding the maximum allowable fill depths, 3 feet. It appears to me that whereas our report talks in terms of compelling reasons and evidence to support, compelling may be too strong a word. I believe the applicant has provided adequate reasons and evidence to support the granting of the exceptions to the Hillside standards and guidance. And therefore, the project is in compliance with the Hillside specific plan in that it is site work for an existing single-family residence. The proposed development is consistent with the development criteria included in the specific plan. Then I think the final consideration was, as required by Section 2920-150 of the Town Code, the considerations in review of an architecture and site application were all made in reviewing this project. So I think that
Okay,
covers it.
I had a question for Commissioner O'Donnell. Did you mean to include the mitigation item for the rear yard?
Yes.
Okay.
I thought I'd said that, but perhaps I didn't. Yes.
Thank you.
So
Commissioner
that's the
O'Donnell.
motion, but we don't have a second yet, right?
Right.
Right now, we have a second.
Okay, very good. Okay, further discussion. Okay, let's see where we come out. So, all in favor? Okay, opposed? Okay, passes 4-2, and you have the commissioners voting, correct? Okay, thank you. I would also just like to just to mention to the applicant that although you were forthcoming with solutions at this meeting, and it's important to do that, there were earlier questions about timeline and when things happened, and I just wanted to mention that I think it's important that we establish a timeline, because what we cannot tolerate is a situation where someone flouts the Hillside standards and the ordinance and then calls it a pre-existing condition. And so we've had that a number of times, so we appreciate that you kind of owned up to what happened and the timeline of what happened. I commend you for a forthcoming approach where you not only acknowledged a problem, but proposed some reasonable solutions, and one that at considerable expense is in keeping with the Hillside design guidelines and standards that are so important to restoring to the original condition, where restoring to the original condition probably would have been a worse outcome. So thank you for that.
And regarding appeals?
Yes.
The action of the Planning Commission may be appealed within 10 calendar days of the decision. Appeal forms are available in the town clerk's office, and the appeal statement must be made in writing with the required fee.
Okay, thank you. So we now have item number 4, which is Town Code Amendment Hillside Fences, Town Code Amendment Application A-19-001. Consider amendments to Chapter 29, Fences, Hedges, and Walls of the Town Code regarding fences, hedges, and walls in the Hillside area. The applicant is the Town of Los Gatos, and the project planner is Sean Mullen. This item was continued from March 13, 2019, where we received public comment, closed the public hearing, discussed amendments, and continued the matter to this date to allow further discussions of the amendments. So we've received written comments from members of the public, from commissioners, but there will be no verbal communications on this item tonight as we close that at the last meeting. Mr. Mullen, would you please update us on what's happened since then and the documents that we have before us?
Thank you. And as you said, this is a continued discussion from the March 13th meeting. And before you tonight, there's a staff report that presents just a brief summary that the chair adequately addressed, and a desk item and an addendum. The attachments included in the three documents include some discussion, a revised draft ordinance that was prepared by some of the commissioners as a discussion point, and a little bit of feedback from the community as well. Staff's looking forward to the discussion and is happy to answer any questions.
Okay. So let me explain how I was thinking about going through this tonight, and then because I think we have quite a bit of information in front of us. Some is new information, actually a fair amount is new information that came to us. So my suggestion, if the commission is okay with this, is to ask some clarifying questions of staff, but not to get into any issues that are really different or in contention from the last time, but then to walk through the documents that we received, primarily the document that Commissioner Hansen and Commissioner Janoff ably prepared and summarized, as well as the document from the community, and they are both in the form of edits to the ordinance, and to walk through those two simultaneously by topic. So we would, for instance, we would talk about intent in both of those documents first, and then we'd talk about definitions in both of those, and then we'd move on to exceptions and materials, et cetera. So we'll kind of walk through it in order. I know that the documents aren't completely synchronized, but they're roughly, and we'll try to work that way. And then when we get to the end, when we go through each of those, we'll try to find where the commission stands on the items that are in discussion. And then when we get to the end, to then look at other items that haven't come up through that approach, including there's a recent desk item, and there are some other additional items I think that were discussed that maybe didn't make it into either one of those before we conclude our discussions and then try to move forward. I think in this format, it's probably okay to ask questions of staff as we go as well. But let's start, if that's okay to proceed that way, then what I'd like to do is start with any sort of clarifying questions of staff. Commissioner Badami.
So I do have one, and our goal tonight, I just want to get it out here on the table, is not so much to rewrite the ordinance, it's the direction we're given by the policy committee, and that's on page 3 of the staff report, and there's 3 items in particular that we're supposed to address. Am I correct in that? So it's these 3 items in particular, or whatever else we want to do as a commission. I'm just looking at the direction we've been given that I want clarification on. I'm asking staff.
You're talking about on page 3, the 3 bullets that are in the middle of that page?
That's correct. Starting with incorporating the existing HDS and G standards and guidelines, include regulations to address concerns relating to fences located within riparian corridors, and the appropriateness of recommended and prohibited materials and designs within the hillside area.
Thank you. So that was the direction provided by the policy committee to the planning commission, and as presented at the last meeting. The last meeting included a robust discussion that brought up a number of points. Some of them have been considered. Some of them were not considered by the planning commission because they came after and were considered by council and policy committee. And when it circled back around to where we are now, they came back up with the planning commission. But those 3 bullet points are essentially what the policy committee asked you to address.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner O'Donnell?
I think our minds perhaps differ. Each of us has the way we think, and I'm wondering, the way that the chair has proposed is certainly a studious way to do it and maybe the best way, I don't know. However, when I look at I'm going to call it our draft, which two of our commissioners labored over and did a good job on, and then I looked at the response of, I think it's five people on their letter of April 5th. It responds to that. And I'm not altogether sure that the comparing it to the initial draft, paragraph by paragraph, is as necessary as comparing what we have done to try to make it better with what I will call the public has done to, one, comment on our desire to make it better, and two, to say how they would make it better. And when I look at their, I'll call it the April 5th document, I find looking at that document very helpful, because it then comments on our document, and rather than going over the two documents as if they were running in a parallel path, I personally would find it helpful to look at the April 5th document and see what we felt about their response to our endeavor. That, one, it highlights any differences, and two, it may be faster, but I certainly would defer to the chairs, because you have obviously given a lot of thought to this.
Just to clarify, I believe that the attachment A, proposal from the community for 1019, which was received on April 5th, was done without the benefit of the draft prepared by Commissioners Hanson and Janoff. Is that correct? So that they were working parallel. They subsequently issued an addendum, which actually introduces a number of completely new items. But I actually thought that there was quite a bit of merit in the community proposal, because they were being developed in parallel with each other. Not necessarily an ideal process, but.
Yeah, and again, I think you're correct on that. I guess what I was trying to get at was, when I read the two documents together, I think they are good documents to read together, because insofar as our document essentially makes some suggestions and their document makes some different suggestions, I find them, certainly the public's document, April 5th, nevertheless responding to some of our proposals. It may not be because they've had that document in front of them, but their proposals go beyond some of the things we've done. Sure. And so I guess all I'm saying is, I would hate to do this in lockstep as proposed, as, for example, identifying where we differ from the suggestion of the public. Because if, in fact, there aren't that many things that we differ with, we could talk about those differences as opposed to talking about the whole thing.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure that I'm suggesting something very different than that, because I'm not suggesting to go sentence by sentence, but to kind of go topic by topic, and I've picked out 7 topics that the ordinance seems to cover, or 6 plus another. So, yeah, Commissioner Badami.
I would also like to point out that we did get another document. Granted, we got it late in the day, but we did get a desk item from Ms. Quintana that also has some good information on it as well. It might not be parallel with these other two, but I think we should also pay attention to those comments as well.
Absolutely. I think there may be other comments as well that were received that are not in either of these as well. So that's why I would suggest we maybe carry that to the other category at the end and do a quick review and see whether there's something additional that we might want to add. So if it's okay, maybe we could talk about intent first, as it's been described in the draft that was provided by commissioners, and get our reaction to intent, and then bring in a reaction of what we received from the community to that topic. Commissioner Badami.
Well, actually, I have a question on that for staff for clarification, because I noticed in the draft that they had provided us, which is Exhibit 3, there's no discussion on purpose or intent. So I wanted to get their input on, do you think that's purposeful for us to include that preceding the ordinance as a statement?
I'll say that our code goes back and forth when some sections have an intent and some, or a purpose, and some don't. I think considering that fences are so intimately linked with the hillside development standards and guidelines, it may be useful to include an intent section here that references that document, which is an important document. And while the code may not capture everything that's in that document because there's so much subjective information in there, it would at least create a bridge between the two, so it would be helpful.
Commissioner Hanson.
I sat, along with some others, many others, on the Plan Development Study Committee, and when we were revising that ordinance, we felt it was very important to put an intent section in, and that is actually in the ordinance. So I think it's important to incorporate that because it brings forth some of the ideas in the hillside design guidelines and puts it in our code. And explains to people clearly what the purpose of this is, and so I from that perspective I do think we need that. So,
Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, I'd like to just say that one of the ideas behind including an intent statement is because there was kind of like black and white discussion, we absolutely do want or we absolutely don't want, especially with regard to the hillside. So my thinking was if we have an intent section that incorporates some of that, yeah, we understand both sides of the issue, then it would help to set the ground, or lay the groundwork for people if they have a question at reading this policy. Also, I'm diverting a little bit from your agenda, Matthew, Chairperson, but we have not included in this draft the detailed of if it's 1 acre, if it's 1.5 acre, and that sort of thing, which the community proposal does include. And part of the thinking was if we don't include that, which tends to get really specific, and then there's so many ways that just doesn't make sense. One size doesn't fit all. So if we take all of that out, but we still want to make sure that the public understands the general position is hillside fencing is discouraged in a certain capacity. So I think our thinking was to include that so that people understand in general that's what we're trying to achieve.
So we've jumped a little bit to discussion about something that was in the community proposal that sounds like purposely left out of the draft, and that was to distinguish by size. So I'm going to just note that, and then we can come back to that at the end if we think we need to bring that back in from the community proposal. Commissioner O'Donnell.
To limit the maximum permitted fences of 6 feet, because there can be fences that are not 6 feet and they're still greater than, they could be 5 feet or whatever. So that's just a word change, I think. And then it goes on to say, endear fencing to those areas where they are absolutely necessary. And the words absolutely necessary are not terms of art. I don't know what that means. And so I don't, when we get into things which are very subjective, because it's absolutely necessary to whom, if it's to the planning director, fine, I guess. But if I were the planning director, I would not want to deal with absolutely necessary. And then it says to provide for. Well, it isn't to provide for. It is to allow for. We're not providing, I don't believe, for the movement of animals. We're allowing they take care of their movement, and we're supposed to facilitate it. That is, allow it. So I would suggest, rather than, our draft will not allow for the movement, but will not provide for, but will allow for. And when you get to wildlife-friendly open fencing, and there's been some discussion about open fencing, what does it mean? The second sentence says, the minimum height above grade, I take it when you say 16 inches, it's the minimum height above grade of the bottom of the fence. I take it that's what that means, is 16 inches, and the minimum space between the rows is 12. Because the minimum height of the fence is not 16 inches. It is the clearance, I assume, from the bottom of the fence to the ground. So other than those two comments, and then we go to the, I guess, the definitional sections we've added. If you turn the page on that, where it says riparian corridor and perimeter fencing, when we talk about the interface between land and river or stream, I liked the definition that the public suggested, a channel, and that if you look at their suggestion, I think it is better than our suggestion. The perimeter fencing on the property line of an individual parcel, we'll get into discussion of perimeter fencing, because I think if you look at the suggestion of the public, so to speak, they don't want fences, I don't believe, on the perimeter as opposed to inset. So I'm not sure what perimeter fencing, if that's the case, then I don't know that we have perimeter fencing. So that's just a question.
Okay. So if I might jump in on one of the comments that you made, Commissioner, you were talking about intent, and you were talking about the sentence where it says, specifically within the hillside areas, the intent of this regulation is to limit 6-foot-high fences and deer fencing to those areas where they are absolutely necessary to provide for the movement of wildlife within the open rural character of the hillside. So I don't see how the limiting 6-foot-high fences in those areas provides for the movement of wildlife. I see that it, I think that it's maybe wording or a comma in that sentence that would make it clearer meaning than what's written.
I think that sentence really only speaks to the application of 6-foot fences. So if you take that long sentence to mean that it refers to 6-foot sentences, 6-foot fences, one, I think it's up to 6 feet. Two, I think the term absolutely necessary doesn't do anything except get into subjectivity. So I guess all I'm saying is I can see getting into the intent of the regulation insofar as they're trying to limit the use of 6-foot fences. I don't know that this sentence does it. And I think perhaps the chair is suggesting maybe that doesn't belong in the intent as opposed to a regulation
That's what I was
about it.
agreeing with, yes. Yeah, Commissioner Hanson.
I wanted to jump in and to say that this sentence was taken directly from the Hillside Design Standards and Guidelines. Now, as to the comments that are made, I don't disagree with those. You know, it might be better worded. You know, the Hillside Design Guidelines were written a while ago. I agree the 6 foot is misleading because there could be 8-foot deer fences. Maybe it just needs to say the intent is to limit fencing in the hillsides and leave it at that. And it's because we want to provide for the movement of wildlife, you know, so we could also take it out. So it does refer in the next sentence to incorporating the Hillside Design Standards and Guidelines, which that sentence is from.
Commissioner Tabana?
The way I read this, it seems like this is just an intent paragraph, more so than a specific direction, because if you go into the following pages, then it gets into the fences and so forth. So I guess you can keep it more of a general language as opposed to specific 6-foot-5 fences, because it doesn't provide clarity. But then if you go on the second page, it does therefore clarify it. So I think general language would be more beneficial for the intent.
Anything else on intent? Commissioner Janoff?
Excuse me, I would just say then, in deference to the Hillside Design Guidelines, so we aren't rewording that, perhaps you can simply say, specifically within hillside areas, the intent of this regulation is to limit, and then strike everything until fencing. So it's to limit fencing to allow for the movement of wildlife within the, and so we take out that middle stuff that seems to be confusing. It still gives the intent that I think is acceptable.
Commissioner Badami?
When I look at some of these ordinances, they say intent and purpose. So the one that was drafted by the two commissioners just deals with intent and does not include purpose, as does the one from the community that was received on April 5th, and as the one received by Ms. Quintana, that kind of separates and defines purpose, which is different from intent. So I'd like to know the feelings of the commissioners or their interpretation of whether this would be valuable to have that as well, the purpose of it, not just the intent. Sometimes intent can be a little subjective. But purpose, when you sit there and say, hey, we want to codify objective fence standards, and that's what we want to do. We want to get, we want to get rid of the subjectivity.
Yeah, Commissioner Janoff?
I don't have any preference one way or the other. The community suggestion, it calls it purpose and intent, and then says the purpose. And to me, they're somewhat synonymous. And if we included both purpose and intent and said the purpose and intent, I guess I would defer to staff to word the purpose or intent or vision or whatever might be appropriate. I don't have any feeling one way or the other.
So I would just weigh in that I think Commissioner Janoff's earlier rewording resonates with me, and I think it's simpler. But I do think that the second sentence from the community that says the fence ordinance divided into two parts, all areas of town and hillside areas only, somewhere up front we ought to say that to people, so that might belong in that section as well. Okay, let's, yes, Commissioner O'Donnell.
Just one point that, as we move forward, I kind of like to have people weigh in on, and that is, a lot of times what we do is we get to a situation where we realize maybe there ought to be an exception. We don't know exactly what the facts are because they're not before us, so we say the director essentially will call that shot, and I think that's a good solution. So I just want us, one of the comments of the public on fencing was sort of the reverse. All fencing is bad except, whereas I think we're taking a somewhat different tack and not saying all fencing is bad except. And there's quite a difference between those two approaches. I like the public approach a lot, but I find that in a sense it goes over that, and the one solution that we have proposed, I think, and perhaps the public does too, is in some instances you can say, here's our intent, and the intent basically is there's no good reason that we have before us, but if the director finds these things and makes such a finding, then the director can approve it. I like that too, because as we sit here drafting, it's virtually impossible to come up with every fact situation. And unless we say there should be no flexibility on a given section we're dealing with, then I like the solution of allowing somebody to apply the facts to the intention.
Commissioner Janoff?
I do too. And through the draft that Commissioner Hansen and I prepared, we included or inserted that language where it seemed to be a reasonable thing to ask the Director of Community Development to make a decision. So I think that's an important point to in fact, I have a preference to not try to create a one-size-fits-all solution for a small set when we've got a large number of variables in town. It's like if you try too hard to address all those variables, you just fail. So my thinking was to broaden it a little bit and then allow for the discretion of the staff to weigh in when appropriate. And who on staff is the appropriate decision point, I would defer to staff. So if in our draft, we say we defer to the Director of Community Development, but in fact, it could be a planner or it could be someone else, I would be perfectly happy if staff revised those to say appropriate staff.
Yeah, it would be the Community Development Director, and then whoever he would authorize also to make similar decisions.
And by the way, just to point out, I think that's a commonality between the community and the commission draft. That in the community, they talk about, we've suggested that exceptions to the hillside areas requirements may be granted if deemed appropriate by the community development director. So I think that language is pretty similar. Okay, why don't we move on and talk about definitions a little bit? Some definitions were included in one and the other. Do these definitions make sense? Are there others that need to be brought in? Commissioner Janoff?
I think we are in substantial agreement on the definitions between the community draft and the commission's draft. With the possible exception of the wildlife-friendly, we combined the wildlife-friendly open view design, and so we can use one phrase throughout the document rather than both, because using too many phrases for the same thing, I think gets confusing. So whatever it may be, I think just call it one thing and be consistent. There was some discussion about including restrictions regarding the least restrictive development area. This is a clear definition, but our draft doesn't speak to a need for a restriction along that line. And then the only other thing I would comment about is the definition of a stream is fine as defined in the community draft. However, in my personal experience, and I think in the direction given by the council, the policy committee, the term riparian corridor is a more technical term, and I think that's appropriate to use. The corridor is in fact it's bigger than just a stream. It can be the land on either side that is seasonally wet or seasonally hosts the red-legged frog or whatever it may be. So I think it's more technically accurate to refer to it as the riparian corridor.
Commissioner Hanson?
I agree with everything that Commissioner Janoff said, and I also wanted to comment on one definition we had in there, which it may not be perfect, but if you'll recall from our last discussion, the original draft that we looked at was completely silent on perimeter fencing, and that seems to be the big issue that a lot of people express concerns about. So I think it's important that we have some kind of definition of perimeter fencing, because at some level, we have it discouraged. It could be that it's not allowed. It needs to be explained what it is. Now, there were some questions brought up by the community that is something 10 feet away from the perimeter, from the property line, a perimeter fence or not. I mean, those are all nuances, and this is where the one size doesn't fit all. I think it's fine to just say that a perimeter fence is along the property line of an individual parcel. I mean, if it was nebulous, we could say, or close to, but then how close is close? I mean, is it 5 feet, or is it 10, or is it 20, or, so I think we should, have this in here, because the first draft we looked at was silent about it, and B, I think the definition we have is pretty okay.
Does perimeter fencing refer to the street?
If your property line is the center of a street, then yes, which it happens to be in my case. But there's provision for backing off the street boundary, if that's the case, later on in the ordinance.
Through setbacks?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Well, the definition as proposed by the public is good, except that it does not deal with the property line in the middle of the street, which is always a bad fact. This is perimeter fence needs fencing along the property line, within the parcel or designated fence setback line. And the problem would be, I'm sorry, the problem would be that it doesn't always, although my experience is in most cases, but it's correct. So I don't know how you'd cover that, but some language, I suppose. But I don't think any property owner doesn't know where their perimeter of their property is, notwithstanding that they further understand that they legally own to the middle of the street. Now, that middle of the street is subject to an easement for a roadway. I don't know that one has to get too complex into that, but I would agree. I don't know how you define perimeter fence and try to deal with that.
Commissioner Janoff?
That circumstance is addressed in the ordinance. I don't have it at my fingertips, but there is a setback that's required that deals with the street. Oh, here, it's item number 4A. A front or street side yard is equivalent to the front yard, side yard abutting a street required. Am I finding the right section?
I'm not sure that's what you're looking for.
That's not what I'm looking for. You are correct. And when I find it, I'll let you know. But I believe that circumstance was actually brought up in one of the members of the public at our last meeting in the memo that he had written, and I thought that was a point well taken, and so that should be included. If we've omitted it somehow, that should be reincorporated.
Other comments on definitions?
Which set of definitions are we looking at? Both sets?
Yeah, we're looking at the set as written by Commissioners Janoff and Hansen, and then we're commenting on that and bringing in any thoughts from the community
So I'm just
discussion
saying,
about.
your question then involves both documents.
Yes.
Okay. Well, the discussion of repairing corridor a moment ago, I don't know that any resolution was reached because the public comment of repairing corridor means the interface between land and a river or a stream that is, and then I'm looking at Lee Quintana's, and some words must have fallen off the page because it says that is depended. That's not what does anybody have the correct?
To be honest, I've had trouble with Ms. Quintana's document in that I haven't had time to absorb it very well, and it made reference to other documents that I didn't have time to trace back. So I would suggest that we review her comments after we've kind of been through this process.
Well, the same definition is found not merely in her comments, but in the general comments. So if somebody could find that, it would be helpful.
It's in the commission's draft
The same
on page 2 of 7.
The same definition?
That is the one that I could find, which is the interface between land and a river or stream. I don't see one in the definition section of the other document.
Well, I must be misremembering then.
Or maybe I'm missing something too, but I'm looking at.
My suggestion on this is I would be shocked if we don't have a definition of riparian corridor in our general plan, in our wildlife management plan, in our zoning code, somewhere in there, and that would be what we're going to go with. We're not going to start taking a different definition. So that's something we can come back to when this gets really fleshed out with you guys. Those are the things that I look at the very end to make certain that there are no words that are not defined in there, or at least defined somewhere else. So I wouldn't worry about the definition of a riparian corridor at this point in time.
Thank you. Commissioner Hansen.
I just had one more thought. I do think that the community's draft did differentiate between an open view design which, pertains to views, not necessarily the wildlife. And I would have that in the definitions in addition to what we already had.
There was a further suggestion from the community to remove the word open from the wildlife-friendly open fencing, not to confuse it with the open fencing. Any reaction to that?
I don't have any reaction. If it's preferred to have two definitions, one that's wildlife friendly and one that's open view design, I don't have any issue with that. My only recommendation would be that as staff goes through and makes these consolidated changes, that they use consistently, make sure it's either or, and
Okay.
as appropriate.
Commissioner Badami?
I would prefer to have two definitions. Not all open design fences are animal friendly. So that would be my preference.
Definition does not stand alone. It merely defines when you are using it for either animal friendly or not. Because I'm looking now, I guess, at the public's open view design or open design means a fence or other structure that permits views through it. Then it says also see wildlife friendly, which is a different, as you point out, a different concept. So when something refers to open design, that doesn't necessarily get to the issue of animal friendly. But defining it is okay as long as it doesn't take away from the animal friendly definition.
I think there is one important difference on the wildlife-friendly open fencing definition. The definition is very different between what the community has proposed. The community has proposed not exceed 42 inches in height above natural grade. Did folks have a thought about that, Commissioner Tavana?
Yeah, I did have a comment on this. When I was reading it, definitions to me seem to be more of a description of what you're trying to describe. So wildlife-friendly open-facing fence for this case. I would suggest not providing direction in a definition per se and have that within the body of the document. It might provide more clarity because I see minimum height above grade is 16 inches and the minimum space between rails is 12 inches. That also leads to a whole host of other questions, at least to me.
And we're just about to get to the height section,
Yep.
so, okay. Other comments on definitions? Commissioner Badami?
This might be for staff. When we have definitions in this ordinance, they might not necessarily be in our town code under section 29.10.020, which might be where the riparian definition is. When we have definitions in these ordinances, do we add them to that town code section?
Typically, no. But we'd look for any duplication, and if there is duplication, then we'd make sure if we're going to list it in both places, it would be consistent, but typically we want to keep it in one place only.
Thank you.
So I would agree with that also. So, let's move on to height. There's quite a few bit about height. It's on page 2 of 7 of the commission members draft, and it starts on the bottom of page 1 of 4 on the community. Sorry, Commissioner Hanson.
My comment remained in the draft. It wasn't part as proposed in the language, but under number 3, where we're talking about the 3 feet in height above the nearest curb, and unless a permit is secured from the town engineer and the community development director. So I find that problematic because this whole ordinance does not propose having a permit, but for this one thing, which is this 3-foot fence in the front, we're going to make people get a permit for that, but not get a permit for anything else. That seems very inconsistent, and so I would recommend taking out that a permit is required and change it to unless approved by the community development director. Because we don't have that language anywhere else for any other provision of this, that seems like odd, so.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Page 2 of 7, top of page paragraph 1, the second paragraph 2, as it says, generally speaking, fences can be 6 feet plus 1 foot of lattice. And in the hillside areas, it shall not exceed 6 feet of lattice dimension. I don't know whether that's intentional. I'd be reminded. I keep forgetting to turn the speaker on. I'm sorry. I just want to ask, is that intentional? It can be 7 feet if you include the lattice, but in the hillside, no, you can't include the lattice. Is that the intention?
That's intentional, and that came out of when this was bifurcated into a town-wide portion that the town council passed in December, and then the hillside. What was one of the main components for splitting that piece off was a request from the community outside of the hillside areas to have an allowance for 7-foot fencing with the top foot being lattice to reflect, frankly, what was being built in our community and neighboring communities. So the council approved that and specifically were not amenable to increasing the height in the hillside areas without an exception.
So that was discussed then?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, other comments on height? Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell.
We were talking a few moments ago about the public suggestion of the height, and I can't remember the inches, 42 inches. Where is that, or is it anywhere besides their suggestion? And is it something we want to consider?
Commissioner Janoff?
It is not included in the commission's draft. Because we spoke specifically to the higher fences when necessary. Well, that sort of says that a lower fence is okay. So we didn't go into specifics about heights other than what was already proposed in the original policy committee's
Part of
draft.
the reason I ask is, one of the things we're talking about here is the ability of the animals to crawl under the fence, to go through the fence, or to go over the fence, which I normally would take to be a deer. And I don't know whether the suggestion of the 42 inches has something to do with somebody clocking a deer. I have no idea. But if you say that, generally speaking, all things being considered, you want a deer to be able to clear your fence, well, clearly 6 feet is not going to do it, I would think. But I'm not sure what the magic of 42 inches either. So I suppose we leave that then. It strikes me as odd that all the fences in the hillside, except as allowed for 6 feet and that kind of thing, should be clearable by an animal, i.e. a big animal, a deer. But we don't know what an animal, I guess I don't know what the limitation is then on making it animal-friendly, that height. I don't know whether the 42 inches was an attempt to bring some certainty, which I wonder if there's any basis for it, or whether we're just saying.
Maybe I could just pose that question to staff. Is there any direction from other communities or standards about wildlife-friendly fences and whether they are limited to 42 inches or some other height?
Frankly, I don't recall, so I can't answer yes or no to that. We looked at a lot of information. Some of that was quite a while ago. This 42 inches came out of the community draft, so it's not been fully vetted by staff.
Okay, thank you. Other comments on that, Commissioner Badami?
If it's going to help an animal clear it, I'd be in favor of the 42 inches.
I would too, but perhaps we can again ask staff to see if there's any basis for that. Unfortunately, I have a recollection of a neighborhood fence that I will assume was higher than 42 inches because the poor deer didn't quite make it. And I don't want to go into any further description of that, but we're trying to avoid that kind of thing. And if there's some basis for 42 inches, one, I would imagine the drafter of the community document could provide that to us, and the staff could evaluate that, because if there is some point in the 42 inches, I would support it too. But if there's no point to it, then I don't want to give certainty to something that is uncertain.
Right. I would agree with Commissioner O'Donnell on that. We're going to kind of great lengths to define wildlife-friendly fences, and if height is one aspect of that, we probably ought to include that. Commissioner Hanson.
Well, in the community draft, they recommended taking out that comment entirely, and so then then the exceptions and the specific instances will come in. So I wouldn't have a problem with taking that out.
Taking what out?
The comment about in the hillside area fences, walls, and gates may not exceed 6 feet. Because we have other places where we talk about what kind of fences are allowed. And I'm not sure what the 6 feet number is anyways, and so we're telling people they should build 6 feet fences. And then if it needs to be deer friendly, it's going to be taller than that. As mentioned in Commissioner Janoff's language here, higher fencing is warranted, but there might be times where lower fencing is also warranted. So I'm saying maybe it doesn't need to be in this section on height, because we have different scenarios in the hillsides where sometimes a 6-foot fence is necessary, sometimes an 8-foot fence is necessary, sometimes it should be a 42-inch fence. So maybe, we can handle that in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed versus in the height section.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'm not so worried about what would keep a deer out. In other words, we've said there are certain areas, where your vegetable garden, for example, you don't want deer there. That's fine. And that gets to higher fences. But when we try to deal with fencing just in general, without any specific reasons of protecting something or other, all I was saying was if there is a basis for a height limitation, it would make it easier on everybody to say, oh, fences there shouldn't be more than 42 inches, if there is a basis. As far as the other fence goes, i.e. keeping deer, other animals out, then the applicant who wants to build a fence, obviously, I believe, if it's greater than 6 feet, will go to the community director. And someone will have to convince the community director as to why it should be greater than 6 feet. And I don't think we have to sit around and figure out what it would take.
Okay. Commissioner Janoff.
Excuse me, as we have the draft configured, height is an independent section. It's independent of the other characteristics of the fence design and location. The community has deleted that item because they've included it in an all-encompassing hillside section. So I think they still have issues with the height of the fencing. But it may be that what we really want to say is that hillside area fences should not exceed 42 inches unless, because we're really saying we want lower fences unless there's some reason, and we detail possible reasons that the community development director would approve. So I guess I'd say let's keep it in here because this is specific to height, and let's just get that number, the appropriate number. And I think I would advocate for 42 inches, and then anything over that can be at the discretion of community development, if it even gets to your eyes.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Badami.
I just find it ironic that we have two different documents from what I'd like to think are highly regarded community members that both came up with the 42 number. That would be Dr. Wiseman and Ms. Quintana. So I'm going to imagine they got their information from some reliable source. Unfortunately, the public testimony is closed, so we can't ask them.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next section that I had here was that comes naturally in the document is exceptions, and that starts on page 2 of 4 of the of the commission. That starts on page 3 of 7. Commissioner Hanson.
You realize that these are the exceptions to the height, because it's part of the height section?
Yes, I
Okay.
understand.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So comments on this number 5, number 5 in the commission's draft. Commissioner O'Donnell.
A very minor comment. On page 3 of 7, number 5, the use of the final sentence of paragraph A, monument entry gates are strongly discouraged. So many times we hear, what the heck does that mean? It doesn't mean no. So I don't know. I don't know either. I guess we're saying we can't say no, but we don't want to say yes. Then how do we break the tie? I mean, I don't get it.
Yes, Commissioner Hanson, I have a comment on that one also.
I was the one that suggested adding that because I was trying to bring in more from the Hillside Design Guidelines into the document. But I do recognize that we don't really want strongly encouraged, or, we don't want to have nebulous direction language. So I would just say take that out. And since we're referring earlier in the document that this code does incorporate all the concepts of the Hillside Design Guidelines, that issue would be covered if anyone referred to that. So.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that was part of the direction from the policy committee, was to eliminate subjective criteria from the ordinance. Some of these things I think may belong in the guidelines, and we may want to come back and revise the guidelines based on some of the recommend or those kinds of things. But in terms of the ordinance that's before us, I would be in favor of striking language that says that says strongly discouraged or recommends or those kinds of things. And there's one less definition we have to do: monument entry gates.
Yes.
Okay. Other comments on the exceptions? Okay. Yes, Commissioner Badami.
When we talk about ornamental landscaping, how do you define that? It may be subjective, and we want to get away from being subjective.
Which page is that on? Just, sorry.
It's under exceptions from both Commissioner Hanson and Commissioner Janoff's list, and also from Dr. Wiseman's proposal.
Through the chair,
Yes.
I believe that definition may actually be included in the Hillside Development Standards and Guidelines, but we can take a look through that and check.
And to add to that, I have the definition here from the Hillside Guidelines, which is exotic, non-indigenous, non-naturalized plant materials.
Thank you.
Another definition for our definition section.
That needs water to grow.
Okay. So it looks like we've covered the exceptions. The next section is materials, and that starts on page 4 of 7 on the commissioner's draft, and on page 2 of 4. Are there comments on the exceptions? We covered a little bit the description of the mechanism of having exceptions go through the community development director, but are there some other specific exceptions that we'd like to cover, and then talk about the materials? So the materials are now outlined in similar way in both documents. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Again, minor comment on page 4 of 7, paragraph 2, sub C, where it says solid fencing materials shall not be used unless needed for privacy and unless approved by the community development director. It would seem to me to be a little bit clearer. I think that's fine in concept. I think it might be clear if we said solid fencing materials shall not be used unless approved by the community development director because of specific privacy needs or issues. Because we're saying that the community development director will determine whether there is a specific privacy need which would justify solid materials.
Commissioner Hanson.
I took that out of the Hillside Design Guidelines and suggested adding it in there. And the reason I did is I a few doors down from us, one of my neighbors has a big, huge 6-foot tile brick wall that covers the whole front of their property, and they have a pretty. I know what the reason is, because they have a very narrow driveway, and there's big windows and everything, and so I'm sure their reason was private. So I thought about that, and then I actually have another neighbor that is currently building a 6 or 7 foot tall fence within 10 feet of the street for their kids' play area, and so I think when we think about what we don't want in the hillsides, when we have the ability to direct it, to me that the solid fencing made sense. As far as how it's worded, I'm fine with changing it to the way you suggested.
Other comments on materials or materials and design? Commissioner Janoff?
Just speaking of strongly discouraged, 2A, perimeter fencing, see definition as strongly discouraged. That's one of those subjective things. However, I think it's at the heart of the one side or the other of this, and I'm okay with putting that language in there. I think it's important for people who aren't thinking about this to think, well, okay, I understand now, reading through this, why it's strongly discouraged, but I understand there may be circumstances where I can do it. So in this instance, I'm not sure what else to say, but, because we're not
Commissioner O'Donnell.
preventing perimeter fencing.
Yeah, that point, again, it's on, believe it or not. I may be misremembering, but it seemed to me the public comment was that if you had a perimeter fence, but it was set back, and I think in one instance it was 20 feet, in another instance it was 30 feet, as they defined, that kind of perimeter fence was fine because animals would not be interfered with. So when we say perimeter fences should be discouraged, I don't think we mean that, but we do mean if you I like your definition, maybe we haven't, maybe I'm just forgetting it. I like the setback idea. As long as you leave a wide enough corridor for the free flow of animals, then the perimeter fencing, you might say, is no longer perimeter, is it? It's a perimeter fence with a setback as defined in their document of 20 or 30 feet, and they define where the footage comes from. And I thought that was a good idea.
Commissioner Hanson?
I actually, since we wrote this, I actually had some second thoughts about having because of this is being code language, and this is my thinking on it. I actually think, even though I understand the point about the wildlife movement, do we really want people thinking that they should be putting perimeter fences in hillsides? I mean, because we don't want that much building. So I think we ought to just say perimeter fencing is not permitted unless approved by the community development director, in which case someone that was seeking that, they could say, I need perimeter fencing because, my kids' play area is right there by the edge of my property, and, and I need to protect them from wildlife, or whatever the reason is. But if we just say, I wouldn't have a problem with changing it to it's not permitted unless approved by the community development director.
Commissioner Janoff?
Right, and I think that makes sense. And when we wrote perimeter fencing, see definition, and we define perimeter fencing as fencing on the lot line, that's pretty clear. So that's why I would suggest that if staff changes the definition of perimeter fencing, when we have this specifically tied to fencing on the lot line, that you make those definitions work the way we're hoping it will. And I agree with Commissioner Hanson that we really are saying perimeter fencing is not permitted, so.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I think we have conflicting things going on here. I think people have certain property rights, one of which is to fence their property. We are limiting that property right because animals have certain rights too, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But to tell somebody, no way, no how, you can't have a perimeter fence, we don't care what the animals have, you just can't have a perimeter fence, seems to me to be infringing on their property rights, a constitutionally protected right, for no good reason. And I
Commissioner-
therefore would oppose it.
Commissioner Badami?
I would oppose that as well, and I want to point out to Exhibit 18 that we received a letter, again, from one of the community members, and they talked about the perimeter fencing, and it had to do with, a recent application that went through council. And as a result of that, I believe that simply stating perimeter fences shall be wildlife-friendly will be very helpful. And then we could then define the perimeter fence, for example, within 20 feet of the property line.
Yeah, I would just weigh in that I would agree with that approach because I am concerned about deferring to the community development director without giving any guidance for on what basis they should grant exceptions. So, for that reason, and I think we do need to have that discretion, but I think that it would be better to be clear. Commissioner Janoff?
Yes, I agree that saying it shall be wildlife friendly is a good approach. However, I don't agree with the specific setback from the property line for reasons we discussed at our last meeting, which is that the 20-foot line, specifically in a hillside lot, could be in a strange, could be oddly close to your house or not. So there could be some configurations of a lot and the development on the lot that makes that 20-foot setback not workable. So I would not be in favor of a specific number.
I could take that out, but perimeter fences shall be wildlife friendly, I would insist upon.
Okay. Commissioner O'Donnell?
I think that would go back again, who determines whether it's friendly? And I think the community, it is not tying the community developers' hands because we've said it's friendly, it's animal friendly, and that decision can be made. It's not like saying something which has no frame to it. So if we followed your suggestion, I think it could be interpreted by the community director or his designated person, and it would give them a basis. So the property owner said, I want to put a fence there, and they said, well, no, because your lot is shaped funny, whatever it is. It makes sense to me, so I think it's a good idea.
Commissioner Hanson?
I do have one more thought on this. When we first started having this discussion, we had many residents come in and talk about this infringement of their rights. And as I was thinking through it, I was like, I can think of my own neighborhood. We're all in the hillsides, and I can't think of a single neighbor that doesn't have a dog. And no one wants to buy a home and not be able to let their dog go outside. Or except for to take it on a leash. And so if no one's allowed to have, if everyone has to have wildlife friendly, my dog could easily jump through that and run down the street and get killed by a car. I mean, so I'm not sure that saying, I'm not sure that it's fair to people that have a right to enjoy their property to tell them that we have to have wildlife friendly perimeter fencing because, like I said, I can't think of anybody of my neighbors that don't have a dog. And so I just don't know why we would tell them they can't let their dog outside.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I'll tell you what I was thinking of. I was thinking of perimeter fences as opposed to yard fencing. Now, that may be not a valid distinction, but I agree with you. I would like to have a fence, one, to protect children, two, to keep the dogs safe and keep not bothering the neighbors. On the other hand, once you get past that concept, if there's something past that concept, and that's where the problem is, then a perimeter fence becomes merely almost ornamental, and it tells people that's your property and stay off it, which is your right. So I guess the distinction between what you would like to see, and I would like to see it too, protection of children, animals, that kind of thing, and the concept of perimeter fencing then becomes kind of muddled. But it's something I think we should make a suggestion at now, so we can come up with some language. I mean, how should we deal with that?
Commissioner Badami?
I'd also be concerned about dogs, running wild and loose because sometimes people have pit bulls and Rottweilers. And some people have condos and townhomes, and they have dogs, and they can't necessarily let them outside because they don't really have a yard. So I still would like to see that the perimeter fences shall be wildlife friendly.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I followed the commissioner all the way up to her conclusion. I would say that perimeter fencing should be animal-friendly unless there are good and sufficient reasons for building, for purposes of this discussion, a normal fence. In other words, a perimeter fence is great as long as it doesn't cause your dog to be out getting run over or biting somebody, as long as it prevents your children from having to run into the traffic, things like that. So many times there's a reason for a real fence there. If you want to leave that up to the community director, I kind of think we're getting a little carried away here. Maybe it should be the reverse, but I don't have a good solution. But the one thing I do want to say is, if I were a property owner in the hillside, I'd be rather upset if you made it difficult for me to put a normal, reasonable fence to keep my pets safe, to keep my children safe, while at the same time wanting the right to have a perimeter fence merely to suggest to passersby that this is private property. And so there are two kinds of fences in that sense, and I would like to protect both, but the language is totally different for either. So you guys fill out the language.
I'm not sure we have a resolution on this, and I think this is a very important point. This is kind of the crux of the fence ordinance, correct? Commissioner Badami.
It's the problem with the one-size-fits-all. This fence ordinance, it's morphed. I mean, the more you talk about it and think about things, it's gotten to how the plan development ordinance became when we tried to craft that. And what did we do with that? We ended up having a study committee that met for a year and a half. I don't want to go down that route, but we're doing our best here.
Yeah. Commissioner Tavana.
Yeah, I would have to say I would agree with Commissioner O'Donnell on this fact that, I think people in the hillside are entitled to a perimeter fence around their property to protect their children, pets, etc. But I also think where we're getting lost here is with the wildlife-friendly open fencing that may abut to the property line, I guess you could say. I know not all properties are the same size or parcels are the same size. So you can't have a 20-foot setback, but maybe you can have a certain percentage setback based on the lot size that might provide enough language or guidance down the road.
It's an interesting idea. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Picking up on that thought, you might say they can have a perimeter fence unless, because of the location of the perimeter fence, it prevents the free passage of animals, in which case, see, depending on the lot, we don't know the lot size. If you have a 1 acre lot or 3/4 of an acre, or whatever, you may not have a big choice about protecting your family, your dog, your children, all that, versus letting the animals run. Now, that's a very difficult thing. I would not be bothered if somebody said, I want to put a perimeter fence in, but it's not going to interfere with the free flow. Now, if you say, but I don't care about the free flow because I'm worried about my kids, then I think the burden ought to be on the property owner to say, I can't do anything to allow for the passage of animals, and show that. Now, hopefully that's not going to be the case. But if there were such a case, I don't know how you tell a property owner that can't put a fence in because of these limitations that I can't think of, that they must nevertheless not put the fence in. But I think if we're talking about the hillside, it probably isn't wrong to think there will be room for the passage of animals on any lot, notwithstanding a fence. And if that's the basis, and we say that, of our rule, then we shouldn't really have a problem.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment that part of the issue is we've gotten materials, this is all in the materials section, a little bit mixed up with location. There is another section on location, but that section on location doesn't address setbacks, which is interesting. So it seems as though we're really talking about location, so maybe we ought to just move into that next discussion. Commissioner Janoff?
Yeah, I agree. We could move that to the location section, but I just wanted to remind myself and that this ordinance specifically applies to new development. So anything that currently exists can exist. And it seems like new development is going to be reviewed by staff anyway. So if we can put some language in here that just makes certain that there's a step with staff where there's a discrete discussion about in your hillside property, we want wildlife-friendly fencing, show us where you are intending to put a fence, and we'll, could approve it during that process. So there isn't, and maybe people don't know precisely, when they first build, but they probably have an idea where they're.
Question for Commissioner Janoff. Where does this only refer to new development?
I think we talked about that at our last meeting, and then the exceptions, the exemption, the final exemption says it speaks
What if you
to-
don't have a fence and you live on the hillside?
Well, there's a good question.
I mean, so Commissioner Hanson.
So I really liked Commissioner O'Donnell's suggestion, and as to whether this statement about the perimeter fencing belongs in the materials and design or it needs to go to the location is, I think it's fine either way. But I think we could make a statement, perimeter fencing is allowed so long as it doesn't prevent the free movement of wildlife.
Don't you think it should have a caveat? I mean, it is conceivable in the world of possibilities that one could not have a passageway for animals. I can't, generally speaking, I think of hillside lots as being generous-sized lots, and I don't define generous size, but normally you ought to be able to have a passage at a minimum so animals can get by. But do we want to say that there's no way that there couldn't be a situation where one has to weigh the property owner's right versus the impossibility of trying to do two things, i.e. protect the person's children, pets, that kind of thing, versus the animal's rights. We're all speaking up for the animals, but somebody probably ought to speak up for the human beings too. And I'm just simply saying, if one came to that, and I can't think of a situation really where that would come up, but I would not want to foreclose the right of the individual to have a fence to protect the children, protect pets, simply because we sat here and said that.
Commissioner Hanson.
So I do agree also that you're saying that, and I can use my own property as an example. I mean, we do have a perimeter fence, and our house sits squarely in the middle of our acre lot, and so the depth of the yard isn't that long from our house to the back property line, nor is it that long to the front property line, but it's longer that way, and that's where we have our fence. So if we had to make it wildlife friendly, we'd be basically putting a fence 15 feet from our house and then having another 15 feet behind it. And, it would just look terrible. And now, in our neighborhood's case, neither of the neighbors behind us have perimeter fences, so the wildlife actually moves around freely anyways, despite us having the perimeter fence. But, so to your point though, if someone really, if people are in a situation where they have to choose between protecting their children and their dogs and their rights versus making wildlife move, that's not something I think we can dictate to them. So, maybe, I don't know exactly how to say it, but I think it kind of comes down to exceptions though. It's that ideally people wouldn't put in a perimeter fence in these hillside lots, but if they do, we hope it'll be wildlife friendly, and there's always the issue for exceptions. So maybe we should just leave it where it's discouraged, and then,
If I may, if I could just interrupt, because you're not even going with your definitions. A perimeter fencing, by your definition, is a fence on your property line. So when you're talking about a perimeter fence that may be 5 feet in, 10 feet in, 20 feet in, it's no longer a perimeter fence. So stick with your definitions. if your definition of perimeter means perimeter, then what type of fencing do you want on your perimeter? You could very easily say that on the perimeter, it has to be wildlife friendly unless approved by the community development director. That means the person puts the friendly fence there or he doesn't at the perimeter. Perimeter is your property line. So he's got to do that or put nothing there if he doesn't want to do that. Or he can come in and get the perimeter there if because there's no way he can do it. Now your secondary question, which you're getting at, is not a perimeter fence, but a fence that doesn't allow wildlife to go through. How far in the property do you have to come in? So that's the next question, but don't mix your definitions up because someone could do a wildlife fence at the perimeter and be in accordance with your ordinance. Then he could do a 6-foot fence to protect his, whatever he needs to protect. But how far is that is the issue that you're going to have to wrestle with, is that secondary fence to protect everything and give the property owner his rights. So that's really the issue. So don't mess up the definition of what a perimeter fencing is because it truly is on the perimeter.
I would just comment, that's very helpful conceptually. The problem is I'm having trouble finding language in the ordinance that reflects what you said. Perimeter versus other fence, and what the setback is for that other fence.
There isn't any right now.
not
So
in
that's what I'm saying is
Proposed.
you could make it that you have to do wildlife friendly on the perimeter, but if you don't say where you can do the next fencing, then you could put it 1 foot inside the perimeter and still be okay. So that's where you need to decide where is a person allowed to put that fencing that's not wildlife. Because what I hear is no one saying we don't want anything but wildlife. So the issue is when are you allowed to put fencing up that's not wildlife friendly?
Okay, thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell?
I think that doesn't speak to Commissioner Hansen's dilemma were this to apply to her. She has an acre. That's not a small lot, right? And yet she describes what would happen if she couldn't have her fence where it is. It's 15 feet, I think you said, which I find, that must be an unusually shaped lot, but 15 feet, you'd say the perimeter fence, if it's user-friendly, then I have to bring in the other fence, what, 14 feet? I mean, you're right, unless we define it, you say, my perimeter fence is there, my real fence is a foot in. Now, you know, that's the Hogan's Heroes kind of fence in the German camp. So I guess I still think you may have a situation where the burden, if the property owner comes up with something which is not animal friendly, then the burden should be on the property owner to demonstrate why they must do that. And I think if that's to the community development director, the community director can say, well, wait a minute, you're not being realistic, or can say, I see what your problem is. And in the final analysis, in your case, for example, you say that your neighbors behind you have no fences. Now, that's great for the animals. But if we say, well, this applies to you too, and it applies retrospectively, you'd be pretty upset. And so I'm trying to think of people in that sense, and I don't like the perimeter. If that's our goal is to say the perimeter fence is here, the non-perimeter fence is 2 feet away from the perimeter fence, that's probably not something the public would be happy to hear.
Commissioner Janoff?
I kind of think we should go back to our original, well, not original, but the suggestion that we say keep the perimeter definition, perimeter fencing as defined, and say that perimeter fencing is not permitted unless approved by the community development director. Now, the community development director doesn't need a whole lot of extra work on their hands, but there probably can be, I guess I'm not sure under that scenario, you could take Commissioner Hansen's dilemma to the town and say, this is my dilemma, I need a solid fence, it's an odd lot, and there would be discretion to approve that. So, I think unless we, I think we're really stuck on a very difficult thing. It could take us a long time to get this right if it's not perimeter fencing. So without some more input or independent thinking, I'm not sure we're going to get there.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I think that's fine, except that I would like to give the community development director some basis, and that would be unless the applicant can show why the location of the perimeter fencing as proposed is necessary for, and then list for what. So if he comes in and says, yeah, I got a weird shaped lot, most of it's going down a hill or something, and I don't want my kids running loose, I don't want my animals running loose, then the community development director can deal with it and might come up with a solution to both problems. Perhaps not, but at least he'd have the discretion to protect both sides to the best of his ability.
So are you proposing specific language?
Yeah, I'm willing to go along with the suggestion that was just made. That is, perimeter fencing should be or must be user-friendly unless, not user-friendly, animal-friendly, animal-friendly, unless the applicant can demonstrate why that is not possible because of specific reasons such as the safety of children, the safety of household pets, etc. So that would be a definition with a defined exception.
Okay, we have one suggestion here. I just want to maybe go back to staff, if staff has a comment on this.
I think you're giving great direction, and I think staff can come back with some suggestions. I think, and some factors. I can't just shoot what those factors might be, but coming up with factors on that. I get the intent of what you're trying to do, and that's to try to make, in most situations, you're going to hope that you have the wildlife friendly fencing on the perimeter, but there may be the situation where it has to be on the perimeter. So you don't want to exclude that completely, but what you're trying to do, I still have, what I'm wrestling with is, and we haven't quite got there, is that person that says, I'm not putting it on the perimeter, I'm putting it 2 feet inside the perimeter. But I think, under C, you have solid fencing materials shall not be used unless approved by the community development director. So you already have that inside fence to protect your animals, that solid fence that has to go in front of the community development director anyways. So
Definition of solid fence.
that's another one we have to work on.
Because I assume, I have perhaps erroneously assumed that a solid fence is different than a general fence. Because a solid fence to me sounds like a wood slat fence, whereas most people don't, no, I shouldn't say
Well,
don't,
let me ask staff, could staff define a solid fence maybe by the percentage of open?
So I can speak to that a little bit with my experience for the town of Woodside. An open fence, they define it the other way. An open fence is one that's visually 50% open when viewed at a perpendicular angle. They had to get crafty with that. But one thing I do want to state to Commissioner O'Donnell's point is one can have an open view fence that's not animal friendly. A wooden wire fence is not going to be animal friendly unless it's constructed a certain way, but typically they're not animal friendly. So it's something that needs to be considered.
Commissioner Badami.
I just want to add that we also have another definition of a fence from the desk item that we got. And it's defined as a structure with air on both sides erected for the purpose of defining landscape, defining an area, confinement of people or animals, protection or privacy, screening, and or restriction of access. I don't know how that works, but I throw that out there.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I don't have a problem with that definition, but I don't think it goes far enough, because what we're saying is, I believe, and we haven't defined it adequately yet, but perimeter fencing will not prevent the passage of animals unless, and that's where we come in with the unless, and then you're worried, and I think it's a good worry, well, wait a minute, is a 2-foot recessed fence no longer perimeter? And we don't want that. We don't want it to be a game. So I think basically we're saying all fencing must comply with whatever these things say, unless the applicant can demonstrate whatever the applicant is required to demonstrate. So we could have the general thing, which we already do, that if you want to build a chicken place, you can have, I guess, chicken wire, I don't know, but you can have something around that which is different than the rest of your yard. So if we say that fencing will be animal friendly, except to the extent the applicant can show why that particular portion of the fencing has to, has to be predominantly to protect these other things. So I think we have to, it's easier to make the pronouncement that we want the foothills to be animal-free passage. But against that, we must weigh the concerns of property owners, and they should have a right to protect those rights which are significant and necessary to them. These two things should not, in most cases, conflict, and that so that they should work. And where they do conflict, then I think the community development director has to make a decision, and we should give that director some basis. In other words, if the director said, "Gee whiz, I really like animals. The heck with you guys," we want our standards to say if there's if children are put at risk, if pets are put at risk, so the director, whoever that director is, not our reasonable director now, will have something to look to. And that's why I keep saying he. So I'm in favor of women too.
Any further thoughts about materials or location? Okay. There's a small section on exemptions, which is on page 7 of the Commissioner's report, and it's also on page 3 of 4 from the community. Any comments on the exemptions? This is dealing with, I guess, replacement of existing. So I had one concern about that, and that's regarding historical fences or walls such as river rock or low stone walls that exist. Those are on, I don't believe those are materials that are allowed. I think that falls into the solid category. And I have a concern that we may have both people, wanting to take down an existing river rock fence and replace it with something, and they'll use this as a justification for it, or the other way around, where we will lose some of these historic river rock walls and fences, and I don't think there are that many of them that they are going to make a huge impact on wildlife movement, but I do think that they need to be, these historic resources need to be protected.
But it does say of like material, the existing fence or wall. So
Except, and then it says, except that prohibited shall not be used. And solid is among the prohibited that comes later in that sentence. And so I would suggest an exclusion of items that are of a historic nature or characteristic of the town's historic character.
I'm trying to remember the Historical Preservation Committee that you and I both sit on. We have had fences come before us, and I'm trying to remember upon what basis they came before us. Typically, a pre-41 house is presumptively historical, and we were dealing with a fence, and
Well, the river rock stone walls, there's been extensive.
right. But if historical preservation has jurisdiction over a stone fence, then it would not approve. You're taking down the fence and replacing it with. So you're saying that you would then have an impossible situation.
Right, you're right. So, any comment on that?
If the wall is individually designated, such as ones that you've seen recently, I think on Alpine, that would be one case where the HPC would see it. If they're not individually designated, then that would be a kind of case by case, whether they would look for
I
that.
don't know that
'Cause again,
all
no
of
permit is
our great
required.
stone walls have been designated is my concern, and I'm
Yeah.
afraid of losing them. Yeah, Commissioner Janoff?
Yeah, I would be in favor of including, if it seemed like that were a potential problem, then I would be in favor of including some language that indicates fences in the historic district, or, you know, whatever language would be appropriate. But- And perhaps that's not in this exemption, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's someplace up here, notwithstanding fencing in an historic district, you know, you'll have to help with the language on that, but I think we should.
We can come up with something.
Yeah.
If you put at the end of the sentence, notwithstanding the above, fences which have been created pre-1941, and then get into the historical preservation language, would have to be, could be replaced with the same or similar, even though they were materials otherwise prohibited under section umpty-ump, if approved by the historical, and then thrown then, I think put the Historical Preservation Commission into that. Now, you know, it gets a little complex, but that's probably the easiest way to do it, notwithstanding the above, and you say it.
And so what this is saying, just to be clear, is that if someone's redwood fence falls down, redwood fence falls down, they're not permitted to rebuild that. They must build a wildlife-friendly fence. That's what this is saying.
Yeah, we've said with this, notwithstanding the above, and the question becomes then, we're all sitting here thinking that River Rock is something we can all relate to. I don't know about redwoods. The problem with redwood fences, I can think of a lot of lousy-looking fences that arguably are redwood slat fences. Nobody wants to preserve those, at least nobody I know. And I don't know, maybe you do. But what we're trying to preserve, I think, is, and that's where we can do this. I'm talking about pre-41, but I'm also talking about, see, I guess you're saying, what if you had a redwood fence which is pre-41 once?
Actually, I wasn't talking about that. Okay. I was only talking about the right to rebuild a non-conforming fence. And there was discussion earlier, there's been suggestions that replacement of non-conforming is permitted. But this is specifically saying that that's not permitted, that someone would need to, to replace that fence, which could be very problematic if someone has other fences that have to be replaced as well. Yes.
If I can add to that, I think the exemptions section in the draft from the commission, to your question about if a redwood fence fell, could you replace it? I think what it's saying here is that it can be replaced as long as it's no taller, no closer to property line, and as long as it doesn't fall into the category of prohibited materials. And I think those prohibited materials are talking about barbed wire, razor wire, electric fences, not necessarily solid fences. I think this is in the spirit of allowing reconstruction of non-conforming fences that have been destroyed somehow.
Okay, because there were two sections referenced there, and the B2G seemed to be a mistake. I was assuming that it meant all of the prohibited materials that include solid fences, and under 2C.
I think
Unless it was B2I,
2I.
which talks about chicken wire and buck and rail and double fences.
Okay.
We can make that clarification when we come back, if that's the direction that you wanted us to go, is to make sure it's distinct, that when you're saying not of the prohibited materials, that what we're really talking about is that list will be discrete and very clear, that we're talking about the razor wire and things like that.
Okay. Other questions, Commissioner Hanson?
I actually had a question for the chair. As far as the concern about these River Rock fences, is it that you want to make sure that they don't have the right to tear them down and replace it with something else, or think that they're directed to do that? Do you want, would you want oversight by, it to be reviewed by the community development director? I'm just trying to make sure that what the language we have captures the thought of it, of what you want to have happen. And there is a section in the ordinance on page 6, in the landmark and historic preservation overlay, that seemed like it would be a good place to put whatever protective language that you'd want for those. I think it's just the river rock. Are there other kinds of fences that we would worry about not being, not wanting them to replace?
Okay, so I'd just maybe suggest that adding a phrase at the end of that sentence saying, notwithstanding stone and river rock walls and fences shall be permitted to be rebuilt. So, on that one, and we jumped to some other things as well. Any other comments on materials? Yes, Commissioner Janoff.
This is just a nit, but under location, there's a item 1, no fence, wall, or gate, and then items 2 and 3 and 4 are the editing went awry. So the riparian corridor should be an item separate, vehicular gates should be an item separate, and public utilities. So that lumped together paragraph should be broken out into the subsections that are appropriate, which is what they were in the draft from the policy committee.
Okay. Other comments on materials or location? Okay. So we finished materials, location, and exemptions. So that brings us to the end of the draft. Now, there were some additional items in the proposal from the community that I wanted to talk about, and then there were probably some other items. Would we like to take a break now and do that, or keep pushing? Push. Okay. I've got to push. Okay. So, so there is a suggestion from the community for a hillside areas only section, and that includes a vision statement and a differentiation on lot size and some additional materials and design and exceptions. I just wondered if we'd covered all of those, or whether there are other thoughts that should be discussed here with regard to those areas. Commissioner Hanson.
I don't think we need a separate vision statement for hillside areas. I think that the purpose and intent of the code should encompass whatever we want for the purpose and intent, including that in the hillsides. There's also in the existing draft of the purpose and intent a reference to the hillside design guidelines. Is that being incorporated by this ordinance? So I don't think a separate vision statement is needed. And then as for this thing about dividing into different size lots, I mean, there is some merit to that notion, but again, we get into this one size doesn't fit all, and so I have a 0.95 acre lot, and my neighbor has a 1.05 acre lot, and all of a sudden he gets all this regulation, and I don't, because I have the 0.95 acre lot, and so, and then as far as these numbers, I don't know the exact examples, but I have a bad feeling that when you start putting things like 20 feet of the property line or 25 feet of the rear property line, it's just not going to work for every property, and we had testimony in our last thing, from one of the architects, Gary, who talked about that, a lot of homes he designs are, the LRDA abuts the property line, and so then you're going to say, you can't have a fence, to protect your family and stuff. So I just don't think that we can do that, even though I understand where it's going, because clearly when someone has a 5 acre lot, they don't need as much fencing as someone that has less than an acre lot. But I don't know how you can put the numbers there to make it fair to everyone.
Yes, other comments on the lot size? Any thoughts on that? Commissioner O'Donnell?
I agree with the comments that were just made. I think when I read that, I thought it is a good attempt to deal with it reasonably. On the other hand, I think we can get too carried away with an exactitude we don't have. And therefore, I would rather be general than specific when I'm not comfortable with this specificity. So, I agree with you, in other words.
Other comments on this? I would just add a comment that this is where we have a big difference between non-conforming and new lots. There are hillside lots that are not a little bit less than an acre, they're a fifth of an acre. And to even try to apply some of these standards to those lots that are very far under an acre is very problematic, including the concept of the perimeter fence, because many of those lots have a good neighbor fence in a standard rectangular lot size. They just happen to be on a bit of a slope. And so, it presents an issue that I think a lot of the things we've been talking about really couldn't apply to those lots without a lot of pain and expense and for those residents. So the first part of it says, for all hillside lots greater than 1 acre in size, the following shall apply. It at least seems to me there should be something in there as a cutoff so that the very smallest lots that are very much smaller than an acre would have more reasonable standards. Commissioner O'Donnell.
I agree with you. So now I guess it becomes a question, are we comfortable with an acre? I mean, the whole thing becomes a shake of the dice, because you could say 3/4 of an acre, you could say half an acre, you could say a whole acre. I'd rather err on the side of less regulation than more regulation, and therefore I'm comfortable with what's proposed, i.e. the 1 acre.
Would you say that again about the 1 acre?
Above 1 acre. I'm sorry.
No, I got it. Thank you. Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, I think for all the reasons that we've discussed, I'm not comfortable with a specific number, and Commissioner O'Donnell said it perfectly. There are so many variations that would be hard to regulate with this specificity. Commissioner Hansen's example is a good one. You know, the difference between a .99 and a 1.01 lot is hugely different in terms of what this allows one to do. I would personally be in favor of not incorporating this language in the ordinance that or the draft ordinance that we forward.
The only problem,
Commissioner O'Donnell.
yeah, the only problem, it seems to me, is what the chair is saying, if I understand correctly, because so what I think I'm agreeing to is, let's not apply any of the specific hillside as opposed to the general rules to smaller lots in the hillside, because it will be too cumbersome. With the age of the town, we have some very unusual lots and some not unusual, but small lots. And we tend to think of the hillside as being bigger lots. So I think the concept, let's not make this applicable because of cost and difficulty to small lots. Well, obviously 1 acre is not a small lot, but what is a small lot? So the suggestion is 1 acre or below, for purposes of the definition, will not require all of this. And that's probably as good as anything, because you could say anything. You could say half an acre, you could say 20,000 square feet, you could say whatever you want to say. So I'd rather err on the side of being more lenient than coming up with a precise number that I have no idea where it comes from. I have no idea where 1 acre comes from. But I do know that it's looser than the lower numbers and therefore will impact our citizens less than if we ratchet it down. So that is my only argument.
Commissioner Hanson?
You know, I'm not generally in favor of putting numbers on things, but I do see the dilemma here, and so this could easily be accomplished in the definitions part of this or the scope of things, saying, you know, a hillside lot, these hillside specific regulations only apply if you have a lot that's over 1 acre. You know, and that would cover this case, and then it would be, but you're still going to have that issue where I have 1.05 acres and all of a sudden it does apply to me, but you know, that's a risk I guess we can take, and there's probably not that many in that scenario.
Yeah, I would support that. I think it would be a very reasonable way to address that, but I want to make sure we have some difference of opinion on it. So, Commissioner Janoff.
Could you clarify for me, or Commissioner O'Donnell, what language are you recommending and where in the proposed ordinance? Because I'm not certain I'm following. Because we're looking at the
It
community.
could be done in
proposal.
2 places. One place, and I look to staff the best place to put it, but, you know, there's a definition of hillside lot. It could be, you know, added on to hillside, or it could be, we could add it a separate, you know, which is a small hillside lot, or, you know, a less than 1 acre hillside lot, and that would fit that definition. I don't know where the best place would be.
If I may, I believe it's in attachment A, proposal from the community, page 3 of 4, this discussion. And it's this section talking about the distance. It kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, which I don't know if I hesitate to go back to this, but the where the wildlife fences can be. In other words, a setback from the property line for the wildlife fences. In other words, creating a setback within which fences would need to be wildlife friendly. Not just the property line, but how far off of it. Again, could it be 6 inches off or 1 foot off? And here they're proposing for different size lots, but they are proposing setbacks.
Well, I think it applies to that, but I also think it applies to materials as well. So,
Sure.
Commissioner Hanson.
I think I'm hearing some confusion. You know, when I was saying I agreed with Commissioner O'Donnell, I do not agree to adding these comments from the community proposal about hillside lots between 1 and 1.5 acres and 1.5 to you know, and above, and also on the plan development. I mean, now that we've revised the plan development ordinance, it's unlikely that we're going to have any additional plan developments because they're not required for subdivision of 5 lots any longer. So I'm only thinking of that one situation that Chair Hughes brought up, which is that requiring perimeter fencing to be wildlife friendly shouldn't apply to hillside lots less than 1 acre. That's the only thing I would take out of here and put it in the definition section. But I wouldn't use any of the rest of this language.
And I would add, I mean, you're welcome to still discuss this, and it's still a recommendation, but when it went to council the last time, they did not agree on doing this for the same reason. They couldn't come up with any set number, and lots are all different. So they had the exact same discussion you had and sent it to the policy committee, but that's not one of the issues they wanted policy issue to discuss. That doesn't mean you can't and make a recommendation as to that, but they specifically stayed away from that discussion also.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yeah, it's not that I'm not sympathetic to lots smaller than 1 acre. I just believe that what we have proposed here, saying perimeter fencing is to be wildlife friendly, unless, really does allow property owners of smaller lot sizes to have whatever kind of fencing is desired. So I think we haven't stated that, but I think the language allows for that. So I would be in favor of not including any further clarification or restriction on specific property size.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'm just thinking in the sense that if I had a property in the hillside and I was 10,000 square feet or 12,000 square feet, whatever, I'm going to have a lot of different issues than if my neighbor has 1 acre or more. And if you said, well, your property has to be animal-friendly, passage, it's going to be a lot different than the guy that owns 5 acres, because he doesn't care. I mean, I hope he doesn't care, because you can live within less than 5 acres and protect your dogs and your kids and all that. But if you have a 12,000 or 8,000 or 10,000 square foot lot, it becomes a lot more difficult. And I don't think we want to impose difficulty on people with a normal sized lot. You know, we have 5,000 square foot lots, we have 8,000 square foot lots. They shouldn't be dealing with the same issues that larger lots have. Now, 1 acre is a pretty, I think, is a pretty large lot. So I don't know that that's a reasonable cutoff. But at some point, it is a reasonable cutoff. And I don't think we should impose some of these restrictions on people with smaller lots. If you want to talk about what is a smaller lot, that's a fair discussion. But if you want to say, no, everybody should be under the same thing, I find that virtually impossible with a new small lot. And maybe you could say there are no new small lots. But if it were applied to somebody retrospectively because of a change of circumstance or whatever, and it could be, I don't think we should be looking for a passage through an 8,000 square foot lot or a 10,000 square foot lot. The buffalo have got to storm through some other part of the property, not there. So I think we should have some cutoff where that person doesn't have to, we want everybody to try to protect the animals, but at some point the lot is too small.
Commissioner Janoff.
I'm in 100% agreement. However, I'm reluctant to apply a specific number for the reasons that we've stated. So I think I would, I guess at this point I would defer to staff to say whether what has been suggested would be an encumbrance upon lot owners in the hillside of a smaller size, or to the town attorney, have we tied the hands of the smaller lot size owners such that they can't build to the perimeter?
So I'm just going to give you the idea of this is that, so you've given us a lot of good information to work on, and we see that you're wrestling with that issue, and I do kind of see that's a little bit different. I saw council's direction was this idea of the 1.5 was 25 feet, or the 20 feet, or should it be 15 feet? I saw that, but maybe the exclusion is a different issue, just with a size that's just completely, I think that's where Commissioner O'Donnell's coming from, that a certain size lot is just exempt and you're not even required to get any, if you need to have your perimeter if you need your perimeter fencing to be solid on the edge because of your lot size, you don't even have to come in for an exemption because your lot is so small. I think that's what you're saying. Let us work on some further language, instead of, just going around and around if there's any other issues, but I think we know where you're going on this, and I think we can come up with better definitions, better organization, and come back with a product that hopefully then will be real close to approving it.
Okay.
And again, not only did you not look at Lee Quintana's stuff, we didn't either, and so there might be something there we didn't see. We're still open to any of the information. I do like, and you guys aren't even getting there, I do like some of the penalties section that was proposed by Mr. Weissman. So there's other stuff that potentially we can put in this new draft that'll come back and hopefully then be ready for real close to a recommendation.
Commissioner Badami?
I just would like to make the comment is we all don't have to agree on everything. I mean, we are going to have our nuances, but council will take it another step further. They're going to have their discussion. The public's going to provide testimony at that hearing. So as long as we get something together that makes sense, that for the most part we all agree on a majority of the issues, I think that's what's important at this point, that we all can agree that we might disagree on some items.
Great. I'm just going to make a last call here. Any other items that we'd like staff to consider in working on the next draft, including anything that might have come from Ms. Quintana's report or any other information that we have that we'd like to make sure is included. Commissioner Hanson?
I agree with our town attorney's comment. I did like in the proposal from the community, having some kind of penalties, because, I mean, if you're going to have an ordinance, then what's the point of having an ordinance if there isn't any penalty for not following it through? And I'll stop short of saying they would have to get a permit, though. I don't want that. But I do think that there ought to be penalties for non-compliance with the ordinance. And it doesn't specify any numbers in here. Their draft says pay any established penalty. If there isn't one established, then that's not going to happen. But, you know, there's consequences for not following the ordinance.
Just wanted to provide one other one which came in the addendum, and that is to exclude all fencing outside of the LRDA. I think we may have touched on it a little bit earlier, but I wouldn't be in favor of that. I think it's inconsistent with other features of the ordinance that have the effect of allowing wildlife mobility, and I think it's a pretty extreme position to take to prohibit all fencing outside of LRDA. So,
And I think we heard that from the rest of the commission also.
yeah, okay. Okay, so to close this, I believe we need to continue it, correct? And continue it to a date certain. My suggestion would be that we, that staff focus on consolidating and reconciling and adding definitions as needed and as staff is expert in doing. There was a discussion about adding illustrations, but I believe that maybe illustrations would be better in the guidelines rather than in an ordinance. Maybe guidelines or a brochure or something like that. But to the extent that staff can consolidate and in some cases provide some additional information, such as I think the secondary fence question would be areas of direction. So with that, does staff have a time frame that they might be ready to?
We would suggest a month out, so that would be May 8th.
Okay. Sounds good. I guess we need a motion. Commissioner O'Donnell?
I move that we continue this matter until May 8th, when we'll receive a report from the staff.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Badami?
Second. Second.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we are finished with item number 5. We will take a break. We have, we need to do just a couple of small things. Do we want to do a quick break, or we're okay? Okay. Yeah, we need to take a vote. So we have a motion and a second. Can we, all in favor? Aye, okay. So we have 6-0, passes unanimously, and a continuance, I assume, has no appeal.
That's correct.
So, okay. So, item number 5, report from Community Development Director.
Thank you. It was interesting listening to the conversation, so that's great. You guys had a lot of good comments on the fence stuff. Since we last met, the council met last week. They considered the Greenridge Terrace plan development that the Planning Commission reviewed previously, and they ended up approving, introducing the ordinance at their meeting. It will go back for a second reading next week. They made a change to require scenic easement, and they also removed some of the findings that would typically come back later for the houses, should they ultimately move forward with that. They also considered an appeal of Peralta. They ended up denying that appeal and approving that project. And so those are the two items. The last thing I just want to mention is that the town continues to recruit for adult commission appointments. The deadline has been extended to June 7th, so if you know anyone who might be interested You can go on the town clerk's webpage, and there's a list of all the vacancies that are currently there, and it has some additional information on that process.
Great, thank you. I had one question, and that was the item we considered last time regarding the appeals process. I know commissioners were quite engaged in that. Is that scheduled to come before the council?
Yes, that's tentatively scheduled for May 7th.
May 7th, okay. We might want to pay attention to that date, so. Let's see. So that's Community Development Director. So subcommittee reports. Are there any commissioners that would like to speak about any subcommittees? Yes, Commissioner Hanson.
Commissioner Birch, Commissioner Janup, and I are all on the General Plan Advisory Committee, and although we haven't met for a while, the town has released a draft of the background report, which is going to be the basis for looking at the trends that are happening over the next 20 years as we formulate the plan. So, and that's available to everyone to be able to read and comment on. And then we do have a meeting coming up on the 23rd as well as 30th to start our work again on the vision for the plan and in reviewing the background document. So,
Great. Anyone else? Okay, thank you, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.